The archaeological record of Northern Europe reveals a complex tapestry of warrior traditions stretching back millennia before the first written accounts of berserkers emerged in medieval sagas. Excavations across Denmark, southern Sweden and northern Germany have unearthed burial sites dating to the Bronze Age that demonstrate sophisticated martial cultures centered around elite warrior classes. These graves, particularly those found at Seddon in Brandenburg and Lyserhøj in Denmark, contain elaborate bronze weapons, ceremonial shields, and most significantly animal-themed artifacts that suggest deep spiritual connections between warriors and specific beasts. The Hjortspring boat find from Als, Denmark, dating to approximately 350 BC, provides crucial insights into pre-Berserker warrior culture. This sacrificial deposit contained not only a sophisticated warship but also shields, spears and mail shirts, arranged in a deliberate pattern that archaeologists interpret as a ritual offering following military victory. The shields bear distinctive animal motifs, including stylized bears and wolves rendered in bronze applique work. Similar patterns emerge from the Gundestrup cauldron, discovered in a Danish bog and dated to the 2N1 centuries BC, which depicts warriors wearing animal headdresses and engaging in what appear to be transformation rituals. Germanic tribal confederations of the late Iron Age developed increasingly sophisticated warrior brotherhoods that operated alongside traditional kinship structures. The Cimbri and Teutonus, who terrorized Roman territories in the late 2nd century BC, employed warrior bands that Roman sources describe as fighting with supernatural ferocity. Plutarch's account of the Cimbrian women, who fought alongside their men while wearing animal skins and emitting otherworldly battle cries, suggests that animal transformation practices were not limited to male warriors, but formed part of broader cultural patterns involving altered states of consciousness in combat. The linguistic origins of berserker trace directly to the Old Norse compound berserk, formed from bear and circa. This etymology, firmly established through comparative analysis of related Germanic languages, indicates that the term originally referred to warriors who wore bear pelts or bear-themed garments. The alternative interpretation suggesting bear shirt, implying warriors who fought without armour, lacks substantial linguistic support and appears to be a later folk etymology that gained currency during the Romantic period, when scholars sought to emphasise the supposed primitive nature of berserker combat. Old High German cognates such as bero and related terms in Gothic and Old English demonstrate that the bear warrior concept extended throughout the Germanic linguistic family. The compound structure follows standard Old Norse naming conventions, similar to other warrior designations like Ulfhednar, which employed identical grammatical patterns. Medieval Icelandic legal texts consistently use berserkir in contexts that emphasize the animal association rather than any state of undress, further supporting the bear shirt interpretation. The evolution of the term reveals changing perceptions of these warriors across centuries. Early uses in skaldic poetry from the 9th and 10th centuries treat berserkers as elite fighters worthy of royal retinues, while later saga literature increasingly portrays them as dangerous outcasts. This linguistic shift reflects broader social changes as Scandinavian societies transitioned from decentralized warrior cultures to more centralized Christian kingdoms that viewed berserker practices as incompatible with emerging social orders. Proto-Germanic shamanic traditions provided the foundational framework for berserker transformation practices. Archaeological evidence from sites like Oberdorla in Thuringia reveals ritual complexes dating to the 6th-8th centuries AD where animal sacrifices, particularly of bears and wolves, occurred alongside human warrior burials. These sites contained specialized ritual equipment, including masks, ceremonial weapons, and carved animal figures that suggest elaborate initiation ceremonies designed to facilitate spiritual transformation. The Vendel period helmet plates from Sweden depict warriors wearing animal masks and engaged in ritual combat scenarios. The Torslunda plates, discovered in Åland, show figures that appear to be transforming between human and animal forms, with some warriors displaying hybrid characteristics. These bronze matrices, used to create decorative helmet elements, were clearly mass-produced, indicating that animal transformation imagery was not limited to exceptional individuals, but formed part of standardized warrior equipment. Bog deposits across northern Europe have yielded numerous examples of ritual paraphernalia associated with warrior transformation ceremonies. The Thorsberg Moor in Schleswig-Holstein contained Roman-period weapons and equipment deliberately destroyed and deposited in sacred waters, including shields decorated with animal motifs and spears bearing runic inscriptions that invoke animal spirits. These deposits represent communal rituals where warrior bands offered their equipment to gods following successful campaigns, with animal symbolism playing central roles in the ceremonial process. Germanic warrior initiation typically occurred during adolescence and involved extended periods of isolation in wilderness settings, where initiates learned to survive using skills associated with specific animals. Written sources from the early medieval period describe young warriors spending months or even years living as outlaws in forests, learning to hunt, track, and fight using techniques modelled on predatory animals. The Lombard historian Paul the Deacon records that Germanic youth underwent ritual scarification and received animal names that they carried throughout their warrior careers. Bear cults occupy particularly prominent positions in early Scandinavian religious practice, with archaeological evidence suggesting organised worship centred around cave sites where bears hibernated. The Drachenloch cave in Switzerland, while geographically distant from core Scandinavian territories, provides the earliest evidence for ritualised bear treatment dating to the Middle Paleolithic period. Similar patterns appear in Scandinavian cave sites from the Mesolithic onward, where bear skulls and bones receive careful arrangement suggesting continued veneration of ursine power. Medieval Scandinavian place names preserve extensive evidence of bear cult activity. Norwegian toponyms like Bjornstad and Swedish locations such as Bjorko cluster around sites where archaeological evidence confirms early religious activity. These naming patterns, combined with saga references to bear sacred groves and bear temples, indicate that ursine worship formed integral parts of pre-Christian Scandinavian religion, rather than marginal folk practices. The connection between bears and martial prowess operated on multiple levels within Germanic thought systems. Bears represented not only physical strength and ferocity, but also the ability to move between different states of being, active summer hunting and dormant winter hibernation, parallel the warrior's capacity to shift between peaceful community member and frenzied combatant. This cyclical transformation concept appears throughout Germanic literature, where heroes regularly alternate between periods of civilized behavior and episodes of supernatural violence. Wolf cults developed alongside bear traditions, but emphasized different aspects of warrior transformation. Wolves represented pack loyalty, coordinated hunting strategies, and the ability to survive in hostile environments through collective action. Archaeological evidence from sites like Upakra in southern Sweden reveals wolf-themed artifacts associated with warrior graves, including belt fittings, weapon decorations, and ceremonial drinking vessels that suggest organised wolf warrior societies. The distinction between bear warriors and wolf warriors reflected different tactical approaches and social functions within Germanic military organisation. Bear warriors typically operated as individual champions, or small groups of elite fighters who broke enemy formations through shock attacks. Wolf warriors functioned as coordinated units that employed pack hunting strategies adapted for human warfare, using encirclement tactics and sustained pressure to exhaust opponents. These complementary approaches allowed Germanic armies to deploy specialized warrior types according to specific battlefield requirements. Ritual scarification and tattooing practices associated with animal warrior cults left permanent marks that identified practitioners and indicated their spiritual affiliations. Byzantine sources describe Germanic warriors with elaborate body modifications, including scarred representations of animal claws, tattooed animal forms, and deliberately filed teeth designed to resemble predatory animals. These modifications served both practical and spiritual purposes, marking individuals as members of specific warrior societies while supposedly enhancing their animal transformation capabilities. The integration of animal warrior traditions into broader Germanic religious practice created complex ceremonial cycles that governed warrior behavior throughout the year. Seasonal festivals aligned with animal behavioral patterns, spring emergent ceremonies for bear warriors coinciding with bears leaving hibernation, autumn hunting rituals for wolf warriors timed to coincide with increased pack activity. These ceremonial obligations created structured frameworks for warrior training and spiritual development that persisted across generations. The transformation of Germanic animal warrior traditions into the specific berserker phenomenon documented in medieval sources occurred within the broader context of Norse religious development, particularly through the emergence of Odin as the dominant war deity. Unlike the earlier, more generalized animal cults that emphasized natural predatory behaviors, the berserker tradition became explicitly connected to divine patronage and cosmic purpose within the Norse understanding of reality. This evolution marked a fundamental shift from shamanic warrior practices rooted in earthly animal spirits to a sophisticated theological framework that positioned berserkers as instruments of divine will operating within the broader machinery of Norse cosmology. The Prose Edda, compiled by Snorri Sturluson in the early 13th century, provides the most systematic account of berserker integration into Norse mythology. Snorri describes how Odin's personal warriors, the Einherjar, included berserkers who had proven themselves in mortal combat before being selected for service in Valhalla. This connection established berserkers not merely as exceptional human fighters, but as participants in the cosmic struggle leading to Ragnarok. The text specifically states that these warriors maintained their berserker abilities in the afterlife, engaging in daily combat that served as training for the final battle against the forces of chaos. The Gylfaginning section of the Prose Edda details how Odin himself possessed the ability to send forth his spirit in animal form while his body remained motionless, a practice called hamrama, or shape-changing. This divine precedent provided theological justification for berserker transformation practices, positioning them not as primitive shamanic techniques, but as participation in divine attributes. Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, represented thought and memory flying across the 9 worlds, while his 8-legged horse Sleipnir demonstrated the god's mastery over supernatural forms of movement and transformation. The Ynglinga saga, part of Heimskringla, offers crucial historical perspective on how berserker traditions functioned within royal courts and military organisations. Snorri describes how Swedish and Norwegian kings maintained berserkers as elite bodyguards, positioning them at the forefront of battles where their supernatural fury could break enemy formations. The saga specifically mentions that these warriors served aboard royal longships, occupying positions of honour that reflected their status as divinely inspired fighters rather than mere mercenaries or common soldiers. King Harald Fairhair's unification of Norway in the late 9th century involved extensive use of berserker units, according to the Ynglinga saga. These warriors formed the core of Harald's military forces during his campaigns to subjugate regional chieftains and establish centralised royal authority. The saga describes how berserkers would position themselves at the prows of longships during naval engagements, their terrifying appearance and supernatural battle fury serving both tactical and psychological functions in Harald's conquest strategy. The concept of Aedra represents perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Norse berserker theology, distinguishing it from earlier Germanic warrior traditions. This term, linguistically related to Odin's name, encompasses divine inspiration, poetic fury and battle madness as manifestations of the same fundamental force. The Poetic Edda employs Oda in multiple contexts, describing both the inspiration that drives skaldic composition and the supernatural fury that transforms ordinary warriors into unstoppable fighting machines. Havamal, one of the most important poems in the Poetic Edda, contains several stanzas that describe the acquisition and use of Oda. The text presents this divine fury not as an uncontrolled berserker rage, but as a deliberate channeling of divine power that required specific knowledge and preparation. The poem indicates that warriors could invoke Oda through ritual practices including runic magic, animal transformation ceremonies, and direct appeals to Odin for divine inspiration during combat. The relationship between Oda and berserker transformation involved complex theological concepts about the nature of consciousness and divine possession. Norse sources suggest that berserkers did not simply become animals, but rather opened themselves to divine influence that manifested through animal characteristics. This distinction proved crucial for maintaining the legitimacy of berserker practices within increasingly sophisticated Scandinavian societies that were developing more complex religious and legal frameworks. Völuspá, the prophetic poem that opens the Poetic Edda, contains references to warriors who will fight at Ragnarok using supernatural abilities granted by the gods. These passages connect berserker traditions to eschatological beliefs about the end of the world, positioning berserker fury as a divine gift that would prove essential during the final cosmic battle. The poem describes how these warriors would maintain their enhanced abilities even after death, continuing to serve divine purposes in the afterlife. The Ulfhednar, or wolf warriors, developed as a parallel tradition to the bear berserkers, but with distinct theological and practical characteristics. While bear berserkers emphasized individual transformation and overwhelming physical power, wolf warriors focused on pack coordination and collective divine inspiration. Archaeological evidence from sites like Berka and Hedeby reveals wolf-themed artifacts associated with warrior graves that differ significantly from bear warrior equipment, suggesting separate organizational structures and ritual practices. The Ulfhednar tradition drew particularly strong connections to Odin's role as leader of the Wild Hunt, the supernatural procession of dead warriors that crossed the night sky during winter storms. Medieval sources describe how wolf warriors would participate in rituals designed to invoke the Wild Hunt, temporarily joining the ghostly procession and gaining supernatural abilities from direct contact with Odin and his undead warriors. These practices required extensive preparation including fasting, ritual purification, and specific invocations that differed markedly from bear warrior transformation techniques. Wolf warrior organization reflected the pack structure that inspired their practices. Archaeological evidence suggests that Ulfhednar operated in groups of 12 to 15 warriors, mirroring wolf pack sizes and allowing for sophisticated tactical coordination. Grave goods from wolf warrior burials include matching sets of weapons and equipment that indicate standardized armament and coordinated fighting techniques. These warriors wore wolf pelts arranged in specific patterns that identified their rank within the pack hierarchy and their specific role during combat. The integration of Ulfhednar into royal military forces followed different patterns than bear berserker recruitment. While bear warriors often served as individual champions or small elite units, wolf warriors formed entire companies that could operate independently during extended campaigns. The Gesta Danorum describes how Danish kings employed wolf warrior units for reconnaissance missions, night raids, and pursuit operations that required sustained coordination over long distances. Runic inscriptions from the 10th and 11th centuries provide direct evidence of how berserkers and Ulfhednar understood their divine connections. The Rockstone in Sweden contains passages that describe warriors receiving divine inspiration through animal transformation, while smaller runestones from Norway and Denmark record individual warriors claiming divine patronage through their animal affiliations. These inscriptions employ specific terminology that distinguishes between ordinary warriors and those who possessed supernatural abilities granted by the gods. The theological framework supporting Berserker traditions required sophisticated understanding of Norse concepts about the relationship between physical and spiritual reality. Berserkers were believed to possess multiple souls or spiritual aspects that could separate during transformation, allowing their animal spirits to manifest while their human consciousness remained present. This complex psychology enabled Berserkers to maintain tactical awareness during battle fury, while accessing supernatural strength and endurance. Ritual preparation for Berserker transformation involved elaborate ceremonies that could extend over several days. Archaeological evidence from ritual sites in Iceland and Norway reveals specialized equipment used in these preparations, including ceremonial masks, ritual weapons that were never used in actual combat, and carved animal figures that served as focus objects during transformation rituals. These ceremonies required the participation of specialized religious practitioners who understood the complex invocations and ritual procedures necessary to safely channel divine fury. The social integration of Berserkers within Norse society depended heavily on their religious legitimacy as servants of Odin. Unlike the earlier Germanic animal warriors who operated on the margins of society, Norse Berserkers occupied recognized positions within military and religious hierarchies. Royal courts maintained specific protocols for managing Berserker warriors, including designated quarters within royal halls, specialized equipment maintenance, and ritual schedules that aligned with religious calendar requirements. The decline of Berserker traditions began during the 11th century as Scandinavian societies underwent Christianization and political centralization. The new religious framework could not accommodate the theological foundations of Berserker practice, while emerging royal bureaucracies found Berserker autonomy incompatible with centralized military command structures. However, the transformation was gradual, with some Berserker practices persisting in modified forms well into the 12th century, particularly in remote areas where traditional religious beliefs maintained stronger influence over daily life. The phenomenon known as Berserker Gang represented far more than simple combat rage or battlefield hysteria. Contemporary accounts from the 10th through 12th centuries describe a systematic transformation process that fundamentally altered both the psychological and physiological state of participating warriors. The Eyrbyggja saga provides one of the most detailed descriptions of this transformation, noting that Berserkers would begin trembling uncontrollably, their teeth would chatter violently, and their faces would swell and change colour before the onset of their supernatural fury. These physical manifestations preceded a complete alteration of consciousness that rendered the warriors virtually insensible to pain, while dramatically increasing their strength and endurance. The preparatory phase of Berserker Gang typically commenced several hours before anticipated combat, involving a complex sequence of physical and mental conditioning practices. Archaeological evidence from ritual sites at Gamla, Uppsala and Tiso reveals specialized preparation areas where Berserkers underwent transformation procedures away from the main military encampments. These sites contain distinctive circular stone arrangements surrounded by carved wooden posts depicting various animal forms, suggesting that the transformation process required both the physical space and specific ritual equipment to achieve the desired psychological state. Fasting formed the cornerstone of Berserker preparation, with warriors abstaining from all food for periods ranging from 1 to 3 days, depending on the anticipated intensity of combat. The Volsunga saga describes how Sigmund's warriors would refuse all nourishment before major battles, consuming only small amounts of water mixed with specific herbs that enhanced their receptivity to divine inspiration. This deliberate weakening of the physical body created conditions that Norse practitioners believed made divine possession more likely, allowing Odin's battle fury to enter and transform the warrior's consciousness. The fasting process followed specific protocols that differed between bear warriors and wolf warriors. Bear berserkers typically undertook solitary fasting in cave-like enclosures that mimicked hibernation conditions, remaining motionless for extended periods, while focusing their mental energy on invoking their animal spirits. Wolf warriors, conversely, fasted collectively while engaging in coordinated movement patterns that replicated pack-hunting behaviours. These contrasting approaches reflected the different animal characteristics each group sought to embody during their transformation. Meditation practices employed by berserkers incorporated elements that modern scholars recognise as sophisticated consciousness-altering techniques. The warriors would position themselves in specific postures that archaeological evidence suggests were standardised across different regions and time periods. Excavations at berserker burial sites have revealed specialised meditation equipment, including carved wooden backrests, stone pillows shaped to support particular head positions, and bronze amulets designed to focus visual attention during extended contemplative sessions. The meditation process involved systematic visualization of animal transformation, with practitioners mentally rehearsing the physical and psychological changes they sought to achieve during combat. Runic inscriptions from meditation sites describe techniques for separating human consciousness from animal instincts, allowing warriors to maintain tactical awareness while accessing supernatural fury. These practices required years of training under experienced practitioners who understood the complex psychological mechanisms involved in achieving controlled berserker states. Animal mimicry formed perhaps the most distinctive aspect of berserker preparation rituals. Warriors would spend hours imitating the movements, vocalizations, and behavioral patterns of their chosen animal spirits. Archaeological evidence from training sites reveals worn stone surfaces marked with claw patterns where berserkers practiced moving on hands and knees while wearing metal claw attachments. These training areas also contain acoustic features designed to amplify and modify human vocalizations, allowing practitioners to develop the distinctive animal sounds that characterized berserker transformation. Bear warriors developed particularly elaborate mimicry techniques that involved adopting quadrupedal movement patterns and practicing specific breathing exercises designed to replicate ursine respiratory rhythms. Training sites associated with bear berserkers contained specialized equipment, including weighted practice armor that forced warriors to develop the muscular adaptations necessary for effective movement while wearing heavy bear pelts during actual combat. The physical conditioning required for these practices was extensive, with archaeological evidence suggesting that berserker training began during early adolescence and continued throughout a warrior's active career. Wolf warrior mimicry emphasized pack coordination and communication techniques that allowed multiple warriors to maintain synchronized movement during battle. Training sites reveal evidence of complex obstacle courses where wolf warriors practiced moving together through difficult terrain while maintaining pack formation. These facilities include carved wooden wolf heads, positioned at various heights and angles, apparently used for practicing pack communication signals that allowed coordinated attacks without verbal commands that enemies might intercept. The role of psychoactive substances in berserker transformation remains one of the most contentious aspects of modern berserker research. While some scholars have proposed that warriors consumed hallucinogenic mushrooms or fermented beverages to induce altered states of consciousness, archaeological evidence for systematic drug use remains limited and inconclusive. Chemical analysis of residues from vessels found at berserker sites has identified various plant compounds, but their concentrations appear insufficient to produce significant psychoactive effects. More substantial evidence supports the use of mild stimulants and mood-altering substances as adjuncts to psychological transformation techniques, rather than primary causative agents. Botanical remains from berserker sites include various herbs known for their energizing properties including species of Hypericum and Artemisia that were commonly used in medieval Scandinavian folk medicine. These substances likely served to enhance the effects of fasting and meditation rather than directly inducing berserker fury through pharmacological action. The spiritual framework underlying berserker transformation drew heavily on Norse concepts of multiple souls or spiritual aspects within individual humans. According to this belief system, ordinary consciousness represented only one layer of spiritual existence, with deeper animal aspects remaining dormant until activated through appropriate ritual procedures. Berserker transformation involved temporarily suppressing human consciousness while allowing animal spirits to assume control of the physical body and its actions. Shamanic elements within Berserker practice reflected continuity with much older circumpolar traditions that extended far beyond Germanic cultural boundaries. Archaeological evidence from Sami sites in northern Scandinavia reveals similar transformation practices involving animal mimicry and altered consciousness states, suggesting that Berserker traditions incorporated techniques developed by indigenous Arctic peoples over thousands of years. The distinctive drumming patterns associated with Berserker preparation ceremonies show clear connections to Sami shamanic practices, indicating substantial cultural exchange between Germanic and Finno-Ugric populations. The spiritual preparation process required the guidance of specialized practitioners who served as intermediaries between human and divine realms. These individuals, often referred to in sources as Sida workers or Valur, possessed extensive knowledge of the complex ritual procedures necessary for safe Berserker transformation. Their role involved not only conducting the transformation ceremonies, but also monitoring the psychological state of participating warriors to prevent permanent damage from prolonged exposure to altered consciousness states. Contemporary neurological research has identified several mechanisms that might explain the extraordinary physical and psychological effects documented in historical Berserker accounts. The combination of prolonged fasting, intensive physical conditioning, and extreme psychological stress can trigger significant alterations in brain chemistry, particularly affecting the production of endorphins, adrenaline, and other neurotransmitters associated with pain perception and physical performance. The fasting component of Berserker preparation would have induced ketosis, a metabolic state that can produce heightened mental clarity and reduced pain sensitivity. Combined with the intensive physical training regimens documented at Berserker sites, this metabolic alteration could account for many of the supernatural abilities attributed to transformed warriors. Modern studies of extreme athletic performance under stress conditions have documented similar phenomena, including dramatically increased strength, reduced pain perception, and altered time perception. The psychological aspects of Berserker transformation align with contemporary understanding of dissociative states and altered consciousness. The combination of sensory deprivation, repetitive movement patterns, and focused visualization techniques employed in Berserker preparation can induce profound alterations in normal consciousness that might explain the apparent personality changes documented in historical accounts. These states can produce genuine amnesia for events occurring during the transformation, consistent with saga descriptions of berserkers having no memory of their actions during battle fury. The social psychology of berserker transformation involved complex group dynamics that reinforced individual psychological changes through collective expectation and mutual reinforcement. Warriors undergoing transformation together would influence each other's psychological states through synchronized breathing, movement, and vocalization, creating feedback loops that intensified the overall effect. Archaeological evidence from group transformation sites reveals acoustic features designed to amplify and synchronize these collective activities. The termination of Berserker fury presented significant challenges that required careful management to prevent psychological or physical damage to the transformed warriors. Historical accounts describe elaborate cooling down procedures involving gradual reduction of physical activity, specific breathing exercises, and ritual cleansing that helped warriors transition back to normal consciousness. The absence of proper termination procedures could result in prolonged disorientation or, in extreme cases, permanent psychological damage that rendered warriors unfit for normal social interaction. The integration of Berserker transformation into broader military strategy required sophisticated understanding of both the capabilities and limitations of warriors in altered states. Berserkers in full fury possessed extraordinary strength and pain tolerance, but showed reduced tactical awareness and difficulty following complex commands. Military commanders learned to deploy Berserker units for specific tactical purposes, particularly breakthrough attacks against fortified positions or shock assaults designed to break enemy morale through sheer psychological impact. The physical aftermath of Berserker transformation typically involved a period of extreme exhaustion that could last for several days. Warriors emerging from battle fury often experience complete physical collapse, requiring extensive care and recovery time before they could resume normal activities. This recovery period was institutionalized within Norse military organization, with specific protocols for caring for exhausted berserkers and protecting them during their vulnerable post-transformation state. The weaponry employed by berserkers reflected both practical battlefield requirements and the spiritual significance of their animal transformations. Archaeological evidence from warrior graves across Scandinavia reveals that berserkers favoured weapons that complemented their transformed fighting style while maintaining symbolic connections to their animal spirits. The most common berserker weapon was the long-hafted battle axe, typically measuring between 80 and 120 centimetres in total length, with broad crescent-shaped iron heads weighing between 800 grams and 1.2 kilograms. These axes, exemplified by finds from Mammen in Denmark and Gokstad in Norway, featured extended cutting edges that maximised the devastating effect of overhead strikes delivered with the supernatural strength characteristic of berserker fury. The construction of berserker axes incorporated specific design elements that distinguished them from standard Viking Age weapons. The hafts were typically made from ash or oak wood, treated with bear fat and wrapped with leather strips taken from animals killed during ritual hunts. Iron heads featured distinctive decorative patterns including stylized bear claws, wolf teeth, or runic inscriptions invoking animal spirits. The Mammen axe, discovered in a high-status 10th century burial, displays intricate silver inlay work depicting intertwined animal forms that suggest divine protection during combat. These decorative elements served both aesthetic and spiritual functions, reinforcing the warrior's connection to his animal spirit while providing a visual identification of his berserker status. Spear usage among berserkers followed different patterns depending on their specific animal affiliation. Bear warriors typically employed heavy thrusting spears with broad, leaf-shaped iron points designed for close-quarters combat, where their supernatural strength could drive the weapons through enemy armour and shields. These spears, measuring 200 to 250 centimetres in length, featured reinforced ash hafts capable of withstanding the tremendous forces generated during berserker attacks. Archaeological examples from Birka and Hedeby show evidence of repeated repair and modification, indicating that individual berserkers maintained their weapons throughout extended military careers. Wolf warriors favoured lighter throwing spears that could be used effectively in coordinated pack attacks. These weapons, typically measuring 180 to 200 centimetres in length, featured narrow iron points designed for penetration rather than broad-cutting damage. The hafts incorporated specific balance points that allowed accurate throwing at distances up to 30 metres, enabling wolf warrior packs to soften enemy formations before closing for hand-to-hand combat. Grave finds from Uppland and Gotland contain sets of 3 to 5 matching spears, suggesting that individual wolf warriors carried multiple throwing weapons during battle. Sword ownership among berserkers remained limited to the highest-ranking warriors due to the enormous cost and symbolic significance of these weapons. Pattern-welded swords found in berserker graves display exceptional craftsmanship with complex steel construction techniques that created both superior metallurgical properties and distinctive visual patterns along the blade surface. The Peterson Type H swords commonly associated with berserker burials featured broad double-edged blades measuring 75 to 85 centimeters in length, with elaborate hilts incorporating animal motifs cast in bronze or silver. The most famous berserker sword, discovered at Langjerd in Norway, displays a complex pattern-welded construction with a central steel core flanked by iron edges, creating a blade that combined flexibility with cutting power. The hilt features a pommel cast in the shape of a stylized bear head with garnet eyes, while the crossguard incorporates runic inscriptions invoking Odin's protection during combat. Chemical analysis of the blade steel reveals sophisticated metallurgical techniques that produce carbon content variations designed to optimize different sections of the weapon for specific combat functions. The controversial aspect of berserker armor usage has generated extensive scholarly debate, with archaeological evidence suggesting a more complex reality than the popular image of naked warriors charging into battle. Excavations at berserker burial sites reveal various forms of protective equipment, though often modified or reduced compared to standard warrior gear. Mail shirts found in high-status berserker graves typically show evidence of deliberate alteration, with sections removed or modified to accommodate the animal pelts worn during transformation rituals. The Germanbu find from Norway provides crucial evidence for berserker armor adaptation. This 10th century grave contained a complete mail shirt that had been systematically modified by removing sections around the shoulders and upper chest, creating openings that would accommodate a bear pelt worn over the armour. The modification work shows skilled craftsmanship, indicating that the alterations were made by professional armourers rather than crude battlefield expedients. Similar modifications appear in mail shirts from berserker graves at Berka and Hedeby, suggesting standardized practices for integrating protective armor with animal transformation requirements. Shield usage among berserkers followed tactical considerations that prioritized offensive capability over defensive protection. Archaeological evidence indicates that many berserkers carried smaller, lighter shields than conventional warriors, or in some cases abandoned shields entirely during the final phases of their battle fury. The shields that do appear in berserker graves typically measure 60 to 70 centimeters in diameter, significantly smaller than the 80 to 90 centimeter shields common among standard Viking warriors. The construction of berserker shields incorporated specific design elements that reflected their animal affiliations. Bear warrior shields often featured iron boss covers shaped like bear heads, while wolf warrior shields displayed pack symbols or stylized wolf paw prints painted in distinctive color schemes. The Gokstad ship burial contained several shields with bear-themed decorations, including one with an iron boss shaped like a snarling bear face surrounded by concentric circles of iron studs, arranged to resemble bear claw marks. The tactical deployment of berserkers within Viking military formations required careful consideration of their unique capabilities and limitations. Contemporary sources, particularly the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and various Irish annals, describe how Viking commanders positioned berserker units at critical points in their battle lines, where psychological impact and breakthrough capability were most needed. The typical deployment involved placing berserkers at the front centre of the formation, where their terrifying appearance and supernatural fury could demoralise enemy troops while their enhanced strength broke through enemy shield walls. Naval warfare presented particular opportunities for effective berserker deployment. The confined space aboard longships concentrated the psychological impact of berserker transformation, while limiting the tactical disadvantages of their reduced defensive awareness. Archaeological evidence from ship burials at Oseberg and Gokstad reveal specialised positions at the prow and stern where Berserker warriors were stationed during naval engagements. These positions featured reinforced deck planking and specialised weapon racks designed to accommodate the unique equipment requirements of transformed warriors. The Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 provides detailed contemporary accounts of Berserker tactical deployment. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes how Norwegian Berserkers formed the vanguard of Harald Hardrada's army, positioning themselves at the narrow bridge crossing where their individual combat prowess could offset the numerical disadvantage faced by the Norwegian forces. The account specifically mentions that these warriors fought without mail armour, wielding great axes that could cleave through both shield and armour with single blows. The psychological warfare aspect of Berserker deployment proved as important as their direct combat effectiveness. Enemy forces facing Berserker units experienced terror that went far beyond rational fear of skilled opponents. The combination of inhuman vocalizations, animal-like movements, and apparent immunity to wounds created psychological effects that could break enemy morale before physical contact occurred. Byzantine military manuals from the 11th century specifically addressed tactics for countering Berserker psychological warfare, recommending the use of disciplined formations and religious ceremonies to maintain troop morale when facing these supernatural warriors. The terror effect generated by Berserkers operated on multiple psychological levels that modern military psychology can help explain. The uncanny valley effect, where human behaviour becomes disturbing when it deviates from normal patterns while retaining human characteristics, created profound unease among enemy forces confronting transformed Berserkers. The warrior's ability to continue fighting despite wounds that would incapacitate normal fighters violated fundamental assumptions about human limitations, creating cognitive dissonance that could paralyse enemy decision-making processes. Contemporary accounts from Irish monasteries describe the specific techniques Berserkers employed to maximise their psychological impact. The warriors would begin their transformation rituals within sight and hearing of enemy forces, allowing opponents to witness the gradual change from human to animal-like behaviour. The process typically began with rhythmic chanting and animal vocalizations that grew progressively louder and more disturbing as the transformation progressed. By the time actual combat commenced, enemy forces had endured hours of psychological pressure designed to weaken their resolve and coordination. The comparison between Berserkers and other elite warrior units of the period reveals both similarities and crucial differences in organisation, training, and tactical deployment. Huscarls, the professional warriors who served Anglo-Saxon and Danish kings, shared certain characteristics with Berserkers, including elite status, specialised equipment, and positions of honour within royal households. However, Huscarls emphasised disciplined formation fighting and defensive tactics that contrasted sharply with Berserker emphasis on individual fury and offensive assault. Archaeological evidence from Huscarl burial sites reveals standardised equipment sets that emphasise coordination and mutual support. Huscarl graves typically contain matching weapons, identical shield designs, and uniform armour configurations that facilitated coordinated tactical movements. The Repton burial ground in Derbyshire, associated with the Great Heathen Army's winter quarters in 873, 874 AD, contains numerous Huscarl burials displaying this standardised approach to warrior equipment and organisation. The training regimens employed by Huscarls focused on formation discipline and coordinated manoeuvres that required extensive practice and mutual trust. Contemporary sources describe Huscarl training exercises involving complex shield wall manoeuvres, coordinated spear thrusts, and defensive formations designed to withstand cavalry charges. These practices contrasted fundamentally with Berserker training, which emphasised individual transformation and supernatural enhancement rather than collective tactical coordination. Professional retainers serving Frankish and Saxon nobility developed different approaches to elite warrior organisation that emphasised personal loyalty and individual combat skills. These warriors, often referred to as Gesith in Anglo-Saxon sources or Antrustionis in Frankish contexts, served as personal bodyguards and champions for their lords, rather than specialised shock troops like Berserkers. Their equipment and training reflected this role, with emphasis on versatile weapons suitable for various combat situations and protective armour designed for extended campaigns. The social integration of professional retainers differed significantly from Berserker organisation within Norse society. While Berserkers maintained semi-autonomous status based on their divine connections and supernatural abilities, professional retainers were fully integrated into aristocratic households with clearly defined hierarchical relationships. Archaeological evidence from retainer graves shows standardized burial practices that emphasize their integration into Christian social structures, contrasting with the distinctive animal symbolism characteristics of Berserker burials. The decline of Berserker effectiveness during the later Viking Age resulted partly from tactical adaptations developed by their opponents. Anglo-Saxon and Frankish military commanders learned to counter Berserker psychological warfare through religious ceremonies, disciplined formations, and specialised weapons designed to neutralise Berserker advantages. The increasing use of crossbows and other missile weapons allowed enemy forces to engage Berserkers at ranges where their supernatural fury provided fewer advantages. The evolution of medieval warfare toward more sophisticated tactical systems gradually reduced the battlefield effectiveness of Berserker units. The development of heavy cavalry, coordinated infantry formations, and fortified positions created combat environments where Berserker advantages in individual combat and psychological warfare became less decisive. The Battle of Hastings in 1066 demonstrated these changing tactical realities, as Norman cavalry and archery units proved capable of defeating even the most elite Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian warriors through superior tactical coordination and technological advantages. The transformation of Scandinavian society during the late 8th century created conditions that would project Berserker warriors far beyond their traditional Nordic territories. Population pressures, political consolidation, and technological advances in shipbuilding converged to launch the Viking Age, carrying Berserkers across the known world as integral components of raiding forces, conquest armies, and trading expeditions. Archaeological evidence from sites across Europe reveals the distinctive material culture associated with Berserker presence, from the monasteries of Ireland to the trading posts of the Volga River system. The initial Viking raids that marked the beginning of this expansive period drew heavily on established Berserker traditions while adapting them to new strategic requirements. The seasonal raiding pattern that characterized early Viking activity aligned perfectly with Berserker ritual cycles, allowing warriors to undergo their traditional preparation ceremonies during winter months before launching spring campaigns. Excavations at departure points like Ribe in Denmark and Birka in Sweden reveal specialised storage facilities where Berserker equipment was maintained during off-seasons, including the ceremonial animal pelts, ritual weapons, and transformation paraphernalia, essential to their military effectiveness. The logistics of transporting Berserker warriors on extended maritime campaigns required significant modifications to standard longship designs. Archaeological analysis of ship remains from Skuldelev in Denmark revealed structural adaptations that accommodated the unique requirements of Berserker units. These modifications included reinforced deck sections where Berserkers could perform their transformation rituals during voyages, specialised weapon storage areas designed for their oversized axes and spears, and dedicated spaces for the animal pelts and ceremonial equipment essential to their combat effectiveness. The psychological impact of Berserkers proved particularly devastating when deployed against monastic communities and civilian populations unfamiliar with Scandinavian military traditions. Contemporary accounts from Irish and Anglo-Saxon chroniclers describe the terror induced by warriors who appeared to transform from human to animal during combat. Their inhuman vocalizations and apparent immunity to wounds creating panic that often proved more effective than actual military action. The annals of Ulster record multiple instances where entire communities fled at the mere approach of ships carrying berserker warriors, abandoning valuable resources without offering resistance. The integration of berserkers into Viking raiding parties required careful coordination between conventional warriors and these specialised troops. Archaeological evidence from temporary Viking camps across Britain and Ireland reveals distinct activity areas where berserkers underwent their transformation preparations, while other warriors maintained equipment and planned tactical operations. These sites typically feature circular arrangements of stones where berserkers perform their rituals, positioned at distances that allow their vocalizations to be heard throughout the camp, while preventing interference with normal military activities. The seasonal nature of Viking raiding aligned naturally with berserker ritual requirements, creating synergies that enhanced the effectiveness of both military and spiritual practices. Spring raids coincided with bear warrior emergence ceremonies, while autumn expeditions matched the increased activity patterns associated with wolf warrior traditions. This temporal coordination allowed berserkers to maintain their spiritual connections to animal cycles while participating in military campaigns that could extend across multiple seasons and geographic regions. The adaptation of berserker tactics to different combat environments required considerable flexibility in traditional practices. Naval engagements aboard longships confined berserker movement but concentrated their psychological impact, while land battles in unfamiliar terrain demanded modifications to transformation rituals developed for Scandinavian forests and mountains. Archaeological evidence from Viking camps in Francia reveals portable ritual equipment designed for rapid deployment, including collapsible meditation structures and lightweight ceremonial items that could be transported efficiently during extended campaigns. The encounter between berserker warriors and Carolingian military forces created tactical challenges for both sides that influenced the evolution of medieval warfare. Frankish military manuals from the 9th century describe specific countermeasures developed to neutralise berserker advantages, including the use of disciplined infantry formations, coordinated missile attacks, and religious ceremonies designed to counter the psychological effects of berserker transformation. The Annales Regni Francorum record multiple engagements where Frankish commanders successfully employed these tactics, though at considerable cost in casualties and resources. The siege warfare that characterised many Viking campaigns in Francia presented particular challenges for berserker deployment. Traditional berserker tactics emphasised shock attacks and psychological warfare that proved less effective against fortified positions defended by disciplined garrisons. Archaeological evidence from siege sites like Paris reveals adaptations in Viking strategy that positioned berserkers as assault troops specialising in breakthrough attacks against specific defensive positions rather than general battlefield deployment. The famous siege of Paris in 845 AD, while not definitively documented as involving berserkers, occurred during a period when such warriors formed integral components of major Viking expeditions. The archaeological record from sites along the Seine reveals evidence of specialised Viking equipment, including oversized weapons and animal-themed artefacts, consistent with berserker presence. The psychological impact described in Frankish sources, where defenders reported facing warriors who seemed immune to wounds and fought with supernatural fury, aligns with documented berserker combat characteristics. The expansion of Viking activity into the Mediterranean brought berserkers into contact with Byzantine military forces that possessed sophisticated understanding of irregular warfare and psychological tactics. The Varangian Guard, established during the 10th century, represented the culmination of berserker integration into professional military service. Archaeological evidence from Constantinople reveals that Varangian warriors maintained many traditional berserker practices while adapting to Byzantine military requirements and Orthodox Christian religious influences. The recruitment of Scandinavian warriors into Byzantine service created unique opportunities for berserker traditions to evolve within a cosmopolitan military environment. Contemporary Byzantine sources describe the distinctive fighting styles and ceremonial practices of their northern mercenaries, noting their use of oversized axes, animal-themed armour decorations, and pre-battle rituals that differed markedly from standard Byzantine military procedures. The Strategikon of Kakaumenos specifically addresses the management of these foreign warriors, recommending that commanders allow them to maintain their traditional practices while ensuring their integration into broader tactical frameworks. The Varangian Guard's elite status within Byzantine military hierarchy reflected the continued effectiveness of berserker-derived fighting techniques when properly integrated into sophisticated military organizations. Archaeological evidence from Varangian quarters in Constantinople reveals a fascinating blend of Scandinavian and Byzantine material culture, with traditional berserker equipment modified to incorporate Byzantine decorative elements and Orthodox Christian symbolism. This cultural synthesis created hybrid warrior traditions that maintained core berserker characteristics while adapting to new religious and social contexts. The documentation of berserker activities in contemporary chronicles provides crucial evidence for their widespread participation in Viking Age military campaigns. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle contains multiple references to warriors displaying berserker characteristics during major engagements, though the chroniclers often interpreted these phenomena through Christian theological frameworks that emphasize demonic possession rather than divine inspiration. The entry for 1066 describes Norwegian warriors at Stamford Bridge who fought with supernatural fury, wielding great axes that could cleave through both shield and mail with single blows. The Frankish annals provide detailed accounts of Viking military organisation that reveal the systematic integration of berserker units into larger expeditionary forces. The Annales Bertiniani describe the composition of Viking armies operating along the Seine and Loire rivers, noting the presence of specialised warriors who served specific tactical functions during siege operations and pitched battles. These accounts indicate that berserkers maintained their distinctive equipment and fighting styles while operating within coordinated military frameworks that included conventional infantry, cavalry and naval forces. Irish sources, particularly the Annals of Ulster and the Annals of the Four Masters, document the psychological impact of berserker warriors during Viking raids on monastic communities. These chronicles describe warriors who appeared to transform during battle, growing larger and more fearsome as combat progressed, their voices changing to inhuman roars that could be heard across entire battlefields. While these accounts reflect the chronicler's attempts to understand unfamiliar military practices through familiar religious concepts, they preserve valuable details about berserker combat behaviour and tactical deployment. The integration of berserkers into Viking trading expeditions created opportunities for cultural exchange that influenced military traditions across vast geographic regions. Archaeological evidence from trading posts along the Volga River system reveals Scandinavian military equipment modified with local decorative elements, suggesting that berserker warriors participated in commercial ventures that extended far into Eastern Europe and Central Asia. These expeditions exposed berserkers to different combat techniques, weapon technologies and military organizations that influenced the evolution of their own practices. The establishment of Viking settlements across the North Atlantic carried berserker traditions to Iceland, Greenland, and eventually North America. Archaeological evidence from sites like Lantzo's Meadows in Newfoundland reveals the presence of specialized military equipment consistent with berserker practices, including oversized axes and animal-themed decorative items. The sagas describe how berserker warriors participated in the exploration and settlement of these distant territories, adapting their traditional practices to new environments and tactical challenges. The gradual Christianization of Scandinavian societies during the 10th and 11th centuries created increasing tensions with traditional berserker practices. Contemporary sources document the efforts of Christian missionaries and converted rulers to suppress berserker traditions, viewing them as incompatible with Christian theology and social order. The law of the Gulating from Norway specifically prohibits berserker practices, imposing severe penalties on warriors who engaged in traditional transformation rituals or claimed divine inspiration for their combat abilities. The legal suppression of berserker practices reflected broader changes in Scandinavian military organisation as centralised monarchies replaced the decentralised warrior culture that had sustained berserker traditions. Archaeological evidence from 11th century military sites reveals the gradual disappearance of distinctive berserker equipment and burial practices, replaced by standardised military gear that emphasised uniform appearance and coordinated tactics over individual supernatural enhancement. The final documented appearances of traditional berserkers occurred during the major military campaigns of the mid-11th century, including the battles of Stamford Bridge and Hastings in 1066. Contemporary accounts describe these warriors as remnants of an earlier military tradition that had become increasingly obsolete in the face of evolving tactical systems and religious changes. The Norman conquest marked the effective end of berserker participation in major European military campaigns, though modified versions of their traditions persisted in remote areas of Scandinavia for several additional centuries. The transformation of berserker warriors from elite religious practitioners to marginalised outcasts reflected broader social changes that accompanied the end of the Viking Age. The centralisation of political power, the adoption of Christianity, and the development of professional military organisations created new frameworks for warrior identity that had no place for the autonomous, divinely inspired fighters who had dominated earlier periods. Archaeological evidence from the 12th century reveals the final disappearance of distinctive berserker material culture, marking the end of a military tradition that had shaped northern European warfare for over 3 centuries. The integration of berserkers into the personal retinues of Scandinavian rulers represented a fundamental shift from their earlier role as semi-autonomous religious warriors to institutionalized military elites serving centralized royal authority. This transformation began during the 9th century as emerging monarchies sought to consolidate power through the systematic recruitment and organization of the most effective warriors available within their territories. Archaeological evidence from royal sites across Denmark, Norway and Sweden reveals specialized quarters and equipment storage areas designed specifically for berserker units, indicating that these warriors occupied formal positions within royal household structures rather than serving as temporary mercenaries or seasonal allies. The Royal Hall complex at Læsø in Denmark provides exceptional insight into the organisation of berserker royal guards during the 9th and 10th centuries. Excavations have revealed a distinct residential area positioned between the main royal hall and the perimeter defences, featuring specialised buildings that combined living quarters with ritual preparation spaces. These structures contained circular stone hearths surrounded by carved wooden posts depicting bear and wolf imagery, along with storage alcoves designed to house the ceremonial equipment essential to berserker transformation practices. The architectural layout suggests that berserker guards maintained their traditional spiritual practices while operating within the formal constraints of royal service. King Harald Fairhair's unification campaigns in Norway during the late 9th century relied heavily on berserker units that served dual functions as elite shock troops and symbols of royal divine favour. The Heimskringla describes how Harald maintained a core force of 12 berserkers who occupied positions of honour aboard his personal longship during naval engagements. These warriors wore distinctive red and gold armourings that identified their status as royal guards, while their weapons bore runic inscriptions invoking both Odin's protection and Harald's royal authority. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with Harold's campaigns reveals standardized berserker equipment that suggests systematic royal provisioning rather than individual warrior procurement. The berserker bodyguards serving Norwegian kings developed specific protocols that balanced their traditional autonomy with the requirements of royal service. Contemporary sources describe how these warriors maintained separate quarters within royal compounds where they could perform their transformation rituals without interference, while also participating in formal court ceremonies that demonstrated their loyalty to the crown. The saga of Harold Fairhair mentions that the king's berserkers would position themselves at the entrance to the royal hall during important gatherings, their presence serving both protective and ceremonial functions that reinforced royal authority through association with divine warriors. The recruitment process for royal berserker guards involved complex negotiations between traditional warrior brotherhoods and emerging royal bureaucracies. Archaeological evidence from assembly sites like Tingvellir in Iceland and Berka in Sweden reveals specialized areas where potential berserker recruits underwent evaluation procedures that tested both their combat abilities and their spiritual connections to animal transformation practices. These assessments required the participation of experienced berserkers who could verify the authenticity of candidates' supernatural abilities, ensuring that only genuine practitioners gained access to royal service. The material culture associated with royal berserker guards differed significantly from that of independent berserker bands, reflecting both enhanced resources and specific ceremonial requirements. Excavations at Gamla Uppsala have revealed berserker equipment featuring elaborate silver inlay work, precious stone decorations, and complex runic inscriptions that identify individual warriors by name and royal affiliation. The weapons found in these contexts show evidence of regular maintenance by skilled craftsmen, indicating that royal berserkers received professional support for equipment care that exceeded what independent warriors could afford. The tactical deployment of royal berserker guards required careful coordination with conventional military units to maximize their effectiveness, while minimizing potential conflicts arising from their supernatural status. Military manuals from the period describe specific formations that positioned berserker guards at critical points where their psychological impact could break enemy resistance, while conventional forces provided tactical support and maintained overall battle coordination. The Battle of Hafrsfjord in 872 AD, which secured Harold Fairhair's control over western Norway, reportedly featured coordinated attacks by berserker guards and regular infantry that demonstrated the successful integration of supernatural warriors into professional military operations. Danish kings developed particularly sophisticated systems for managing berserker guards that reflected the more centralized nature of Danish political organization compared to their Norwegian and Swedish counterparts. Archaeological evidence from Jelling reveals a complex of buildings specifically designed for housing royal berserkers, complete with individual chambers for transformation rituals, communal areas for group ceremonies, and specialized armories for storing their distinctive equipment. The layout suggests that Danish royal berserkers operated under more formal organizational structures than their counterparts elsewhere in Scandinavia. King Swene Forkbeard's conquest campaigns in England during the early 11th century employed berserker guards in roles that combined traditional shock tactics with sophisticated intelligence gathering and psychological warfare. Contemporary English sources describe Danish berserkers who served as advance scouts during the invasion preparations, using their ability to operate independently in hostile territory while maintaining their supernatural combat capabilities when direct confrontation became necessary. The Chronicle of Tietmar of Merseburg specifically mentions Danish berserkers, who could move undetected through English defensive positions, gathering crucial intelligence about enemy dispositions and fortifications. The evolution of berserker guards from ritual warriors to professional military elites involved significant changes in their training regimens and organisational structures. Archaeological evidence from training facilities at sites like Trelleborg in Denmark reveals standardised obstacle courses and practice areas designed for coordinated group exercises rather than individual spiritual development. These facilities feature multiple parallel training lanes that allowed entire berserker units to practice synchronized movements, suggesting that royal guards developed collective tactics that complemented their individual supernatural abilities. Swedish kings employed berserker guards in administrative as well as military capacities, utilizing their fearsome reputations to enforce royal authority in remote territories where conventional bureaucratic control remained limited. The Westrogothic law contains references to royal berserkers who served as tax collectors and legal enforcers, their supernatural status providing additional authority when dealing with recalcitrant local populations. Archaeological evidence from administrative centres in Västergötland reveals specialised quarters for visiting berserker officials, complete with ritual preparation areas that allowed them to maintain their spiritual practices while conducting royal business. The relationship between berserker guards and other elite military units within royal service created complex hierarchical structures that reflected both military effectiveness and social status. Huskarls, the professional warriors who formed the backbone of royal armies, occupied different roles that emphasised formation fighting and defensive tactics, while berserker guards specialised in breakthrough attacks and psychological warfare. Archaeological evidence from royal military camps reveals distinct equipment storage areas and living quarters that maintained separation between these different warrior types while facilitating coordination during military campaigns. The Jomsvikings, the legendary mercenary brotherhood based on the island of Volyn, represented a unique evolution of berserker traditions that combined traditional warrior practices with innovative organisational structures. Archaeological excavations at Volyn have revealed evidence of a sophisticated military complex featuring specialised training facilities, weapon workshops, and ritual areas that suggest the Jomsvikings maintained berserker traditions while operating as professional mercenaries serving multiple royal patrons. The site contains distinctive burial areas with grave goods that blend traditional berserker symbolism with standardized military equipment, indicating a hybrid warrior culture that adapted ancient practices to contemporary military requirements. The Jomsviking organization established recruitment standards that required potential members to demonstrate both exceptional combat skills and adherence to specific behavioral codes that regulated their supernatural practices. The Jomsvikings saga describes initiation ceremonies that combine traditional berserker transformation rituals with oath-taking procedures that bound warriors to the Brotherhood's collective discipline. Archaeological evidence suggests that these ceremonies took place in specialised ritual complexes, featuring stone circles, carved wooden posts, and acoustic features designed to amplify the vocalizations associated with berserker transformation. The military effectiveness of royal berserker guards gradually declined during the 11th century as warfare evolved towards more sophisticated tactical systems that emphasize coordination over individual prowess. The increasing use of cavalry, crossbow units, and fortified positions created combat environments where berserker advantages became less decisive, while their supernatural practices increasingly conflicted with Christian religious influences that were gaining strength throughout Scandinavia. Archaeological evidence from late 11th century royal sites shows the gradual disappearance of specialised berserker facilities, replaced by conventional military barracks and Christian chapels. The transition from berserker guards to conventional royal retainers involved complex negotiations that sought to preserve the military effectiveness of these warriors while adapting their practices to changing religious and social requirements. Some royal courts attempted to maintain modified berserker traditions by reinterpreting their supernatural abilities as divine gifts compatible with Christian theology, while others gradually replaced berserker guards with conventional warriors who lacked supernatural associations. Archaeological evidence from this transitional period reveals hybrid equipment that combines traditional berserker symbolism with Christian religious imagery, suggesting attempts to reconcile ancient warrior traditions with new religious frameworks. The Varangian Guard in Byzantine service represented the most successful adaptation of berserker traditions to changing military and political conditions. These Scandinavian warriors maintained many of their traditional practices while serving the Byzantine emperor, their distinctive fighting styles and ceremonial behaviours earning them elite status within the imperial military hierarchy. Archaeological evidence from Constantinople reveals Varangian quarters that feature specialised areas for traditional rituals alongside Orthodox Christian chapels, indicating successful integration of ancient warrior traditions with contemporary religious requirements. The professional military units that emerged during the later Viking Age incorporated elements of berserker organisation while abandoning the supernatural aspects that had defined earlier warrior traditions. The Lidang system that developed in Denmark and Norway created standardised military obligations that required specific numbers of warriors from designated territories, replacing the voluntary associations that had characterised berserker brotherhoods. Archaeological evidence from Lidang assembly points reveals standardised equipment caches and training facilities that emphasised uniform appearance and coordinated tactics rather than individual supernatural enhancement. The transformation of elite warrior culture during the 11th century reflected broader changes in Scandinavian society as centralised monarchies consolidated power and Christian influences gained strength. Royal courts that had once competed to attract the most powerful berserker warriors began emphasising different qualities in their military retainers, including literacy, administrative skills, and adherence to Christian behavioural codes. Archaeological evidence from royal sites during this period shows the gradual replacement of traditional warrior symbols with Christian religious imagery and standardised military equipment that reflected new organisational priorities. The legacy of berserker royal guards persisted in modified forms throughout the medieval period, with some Scandinavian courts maintaining ceremonial positions that preserved elements of ancient warrior traditions while adapting them to contemporary requirements. These positions often involved responsibility for royal regalia, ceremonial weapons, and traditional court rituals that maintained connections to pre-Christian royal ideology, while operating within Christian political frameworks. Archaeological evidence suggests that holders of these positions sometimes maintained private collections of traditional warrior equipment, preserving material links to berserker traditions long after their military effectiveness had ended. The transformation of berserkers from historical warriors into literary archetypes began during the 12th and 13th centuries as Icelandic saga writers drew upon oral traditions, historical memories, and contemporary social concerns to create complex narratives that both preserved and reimagined the berserker phenomenon. The Eagles Saga, composed around 1230 AD, presents one of the most nuanced portrayals of berserker psychology and social integration, depicting its protagonist Egil Skallagrimsson as a warrior whose berserker heritage shapes both his extraordinary abilities and his troubled relationships within Icelandic society. The saga describes how Egil's father Skallagrim possessed berserker traits that manifested during moments of intense anger or physical exertion, transforming him from a respected farmer and metalworker into a dangerous figure whose own family feared his presence. Skallagrim's berserker episodes in Egil's saga follow patterns that reflect genuine historical understanding of berserker transformation, while serving specific literary functions within the narrative structure. The saga describes how his face would darken and swell during these episodes, his strength would increase dramatically, and he would become virtually unrecognisable to those who knew him in normal circumstances. During one particularly detailed episode, Skallagrim attacks his own son during a ball game, nearly killing the boy before the berserker fury subsides and he realizes what he's done. This portrayal demonstrates the saga author's familiarity with actual berserker behaviour patterns, while using these episodes to explore themes of family dysfunction and social alienation. The literary treatment of berserker inheritance in Egil's saga reflects medieval Icelandic understanding of how these traits pass through family lines while adapting historical realities to serve narrative purposes. Egil himself displays berserker characteristics during crucial moments in the saga, including his famous confrontation with King Eric Bloodaxe and his supernatural strength during various combat encounters. However, the saga presents these abilities as both blessing and curse, enabling Egil's success as a warrior and poet, while creating persistent social problems that alienate him from normal community relationships. The Volsunga saga provides a different perspective on berserker traditions by integrating them into legendary narratives that blur the boundaries between historical memory and mythological storytelling. The saga's portrayal of Sigmund and his descendants incorporates berserker elements into a broader framework of heroic literature that emphasizes supernatural abilities while maintaining connections to recognizable warrior practices. Sigmund's ability to transform his consciousness during combat, his use of animal imagery in his poetry, and his rejection of conventional social constraints all reflect berserker characteristics adapted for legendary narrative purposes. The bear warrior elements in Volsunga saga appear most prominently in the episodes involving Sigmund's forest exile, where he and his son Sinfjotli live as outlaws and develop their supernatural combat abilities through isolation and ritual practice. The saga describes how they discover wolf pelts that enable them to transform into wolves for 10 days at a time, during which they can communicate only through howling and must hunt for survival like actual wolves. This narrative combines historical knowledge of Ulfhedna practices with folktale elements that emphasize the dangerous nature of warrior transformation while exploring themes of kinship and social boundaries. The Grettir's saga presents berserker traditions through the lens of social criticism, using its protagonist's supernatural strength and antisocial behaviour to comment on the tensions between individual prowess and community stability that characterised medieval Icelandic society. Grettir's berserker-like abilities manifest as exceptional physical strength, resistance to supernatural threats, and difficulty controlling his temper during social interactions. The saga explicitly connects these traits to his inability to function within normal social frameworks, portraying him as simultaneously heroic and tragic figure whose extraordinary abilities make normal life impossible. The literary evolution of berserker portrayals reveals changing attitudes toward violence and social order as Icelandic society developed more sophisticated legal and religious institutions. Early saga literature tends to present berserker abilities as divine gifts that enhance warrior effectiveness, while later works increasingly emphasize the social costs and personal isolation associated with these supernatural traits. The Laxdæla saga contains several berserker characters whose abilities create problems for their families and communities, suggesting that 13th century audiences viewed these traditions with considerable ambivalence. Skaldic poetry from the 9th through 11th centuries provides crucial evidence for how berserkers were perceived by their contemporaries, though the complex metaphorical language and elusive style of this poetic tradition creates significant interpretive challenges. The praise poems composed for Norwegian and Danish kings frequently reference berserker warriors using kennings that emphasize their animal associations and supernatural combat abilities. Thorbjorn Hornklofi's Haraldskvæði, composed for King Harald Fairhair around 900 AD, contains several stanzas that describe the king's berserker retainers using animal metaphors that appear to reflect genuine understanding of their transformation practices. The kenning system employed in Skaldic poetry created elaborate metaphorical structures that could reference berserker characteristics without explicit description, requiring audiences to possess detailed knowledge of warrior traditions to understand the poetic references. Berserkers appear in these poems as Odin's men, bear-strong warriors, wolf eaters, and through various compound expressions that emphasize their animal associations and divine connections. The Glimdrupper by Thordis Jarriksson contains particularly complex berserker imagery that combines references to bear transformation with allusions to Odin's supernatural abilities, suggesting that educated audiences understood these warriors as participating in divine rather than merely human activities. The reliability of skaldic poetry as historical evidence remains contentious among modern scholars, with some arguing that the contemporary composition of many poems provides authentic insights into berserker practices, while others contend that the highly stylized poetic language obscures rather than illuminates historical realities. Archaeological evidence from the periods when these poems were composed generally supports their descriptions of berserker equipment, social status, and military functions, though the supernatural elements clearly reflect religious beliefs rather than objective observations of warrior behaviour. The preservation of berserker traditions through oral storytelling created complex processes of cultural transmission that both maintained historical memories and adapted them to changing social circumstances. The oral tradition that preceded written saga composition operated through networks of storytellers who specialized in preserving and performing traditional narratives during social gatherings, seasonal festivals, and formal assemblies. Archaeological evidence from sites like Thingvellir in Iceland reveals specialized performance areas where storytellers would recite traditional tales to audiences that included both local community members and visitors from distant regions. The social functions of oral berserker narratives extended beyond entertainment to include education about warrior traditions, moral instruction about the proper use of supernatural abilities, and community bonding through shared cultural knowledge. Storytellers would adapt traditional narratives to address contemporary concerns while maintaining core elements that preserved historical memories of actual berserker practices. This adaptive process created multiple versions of berserker stories that reflected different regional traditions and social perspectives while sharing fundamental narrative structures and character types. The transition from oral to written tradition during the 12th and 13th centuries created opportunities for more systematic preservation of berserker lore, while introducing new forms of literary elaboration that transformed historical memories into sophisticated narrative art. Saga authors drew upon extensive oral traditions while adding their own interpretive frameworks that reflected contemporary religious, legal, and social concerns. The result was a body of literature that preserved valuable historical information about berserker practices, while adapting these traditions to serve the cultural needs of medieval Icelandic society. The geographical distribution of berserker stories in saga literature reflects the historical spread of these warrior traditions, while revealing regional variations in how different communities remembered and interpreted berserker practices. Norwegian sagas tend to emphasize the royal connections of berserker warriors and their roles in unification campaigns, while Icelandic family sagas focus more on the social problems created by berserker traits within settler communities. Danish historical works present berserkers primarily as military specialists serving royal courts, reflecting the more centralized political structures that characterized medieval Denmark. The chronological development of saga literature reveals evolving attitudes towards berserker traditions as Icelandic society became increasingly Christianized and legally sophisticated. The earliest sagas, composed during the late 12th century, generally present berserker abilities as legitimate expressions of divine favour that enhance warrior effectiveness and social status. Later works show increasing concern with the social costs of berserker behaviour, emphasising themes of alienation, family conflict, and community disruption that reflect changing social values and religious influences. The literary transformation of berserkers from historical warriors to legendary figures involved systematic exaggeration of their supernatural abilities while maintaining recognizable connections to actual warrior practices. Saga authors enhanced the physical strength, combat endurance, and transformation capabilities of their berserker characters beyond historically plausible levels, while preserving details about equipment, training methods, and social relationships that reflect genuine historical knowledge. This combination of fantastic elaboration and realistic detail created compelling literary characters that served both entertainment and educational functions within medieval Icelandic culture. The influence of Christian theology on saga portrayals of berserkers created complex narrative tensions between admiration for warrior prowess and condemnation of practices associated with pagan religious traditions. Some saga authors attempted to reconcile berserker abilities with Christian beliefs by presenting them as divine gifts that could be used for righteous purposes, while others emphasized the demonic associations of berserker transformation to support Christian moral teachings. The Brennu Njáls saga contains several episodes where berserker characters struggle with the conflict between their traditional practices and Christian religious obligations, reflecting broader cultural tensions within medieval Icelandic society. The legal framework that developed in medieval Iceland created new contexts for understanding berserker behaviour that influenced how saga authors portrayed these warriors in their narratives. The Gragas Law Code contains specific provisions addressing berserker violence and the legal responsibilities of individuals who possessed supernatural combat abilities. Saga authors incorporated these legal perspectives into their narratives using berserker episodes to explore questions about individual responsibility, community safety, and the proper limits of warrior autonomy within organised society. The international circulation of Icelandic sagas during the later medieval period carried berserker narratives beyond Scandinavia to audiences throughout Northern Europe who lacked direct historical knowledge of these warrior traditions. This broader circulation transformed berserker stories into general European literary motifs that influenced the development of chivalric romance and other narrative genres. The process created feedback loops where continental European literary influences affected later Icelandic saga composition, gradually moving berserker portrayals further away from their historical origins toward more generalized literary archetypes. The manuscript tradition that preserved saga literature reveals the continuing popularity of berserker narratives throughout the medieval period, while documenting the gradual transformation of these stories through successive copying and editorial processes. Different manuscript versions of the same saga often contain variations in berserker episodes that reflect changing social attitudes and literary preferences. The AM 132 full manuscript of Egil's saga, copied during the 14th century, contains several berserker episodes that differ significantly from earlier versions, suggesting that scribes felt free to modify these narratives to suit contemporary tastes and moral sensibilities. The scholarly study of berserker traditions in saga literature began during the 19th century as part of a broader romantic interest in medieval Scandinavian culture. Though early researchers often imposed modern psychological and anthropological frameworks that distorted historical understanding of these warrior practices, the work of scholars like Finnur Jonsson and Andreas Häusler established fundamental principles for analysing saga portrayals of berserkers while recognising the complex relationships between historical memory, oral tradition, and literary elaboration that shaped these narratives. The systematic conversion of Scandinavian societies to Christianity during the 10th and 11th centuries create irreconcilable tensions with traditional berserker practices that ultimately led to their suppression and transformation. The theological framework of Christianity, with its emphasis on divine monotheism, rejection of pagan spiritual practices, and condemnation of what church authorities viewed as demonic possession, proved fundamentally incompatible with Berserker traditions rooted in animal transformation and Odinic divine inspiration. Archaeological evidence from sites across Norway, Denmark and Sweden reveals the gradual abandonment of Berserker ritual facilities during this period, replaced by Christian churches and monasteries that actively promoted alternative models of warrior identity based on Christian knighthood and crusading ideology. The initial encounters between Christian missionaries and Berserker warriors created complex negotiations that reflected both religious conviction and political pragmatism. King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, who ruled from 995 to 1000 AD, faced particular challenges in reconciling his conversion to Christianity with the military effectiveness of Berserker units that had traditionally formed the elite core of royal armies. Contemporary sources describe how Olaf attempted to maintain Berserker guards while requiring them to abandon their traditional transformation rituals in favour of Christian prayer and blessing ceremonies before battle. This compromise proved unsustainable as Berserkers found that their combat effectiveness diminished without the spiritual preparation that had previously enabled their supernatural abilities. The saga of Olaf Tryggvason documents specific incidents where the king's attempts to Christianize his Berserker retainers led to military failures and internal conflicts within the royal court. During the Battle of Svolder in 1000 AD, Olaf's Berserker guards reportedly fought with conventional weapons and tactics rather than their traditional supernatural fury, contributing to the Norwegian defeat and the king's death. The saga describes how these warriors, deprived of their traditional spiritual practices, became demoralized and ineffective, many subsequently abandoning royal service to seek refuge in remote areas where they could maintain their ancestral traditions without Christian interference. The theological arguments employed by Christian authorities against Berserker practices drew upon established church doctrine regarding demonic possession and pagan religious activities. Archbishop Adalbert of Hamburg-Bremen, whose jurisdiction included much of Scandinavia during the 11th century, wrote extensively about the spiritual dangers posed by warriors who claimed divine inspiration through animal transformation. His letters to Scandinavian rulers describe Berserker practices as clear evidence of demonic influence that threatened the spiritual welfare of entire kingdoms. These theological positions were reinforced by papal decrees that explicitly condemned shape-changing practices and animal transformation rituals as incompatible with Christian faith. The process of legal suppression began with royal edicts that gradually restricted Berserker activities while providing alternative paths for warrior service within Christianized military structures. King Olaf II of Norway, later canonized as Saint Olaf, issued comprehensive laws during the 1020s that prohibited traditional Berserker transformation rituals while establishing new military organizations based on Christian principles. The older Frostating law contains specific provisions that outlawed Berserker gang and imposed severe penalties including exile and property confiscation for warriors who continued practicing traditional transformation ceremonies. Legal restrictions on Berserker activities extended beyond simple prohibition to include systematic dismantling of the social and economic structures that had supported these warrior traditions. The Norwegian law codes established during the 11th century eliminated the traditional legal immunities that had protected Berserkers during their transformation states, making them fully liable for any violence committed while under the influence of battle fury. This legal change fundamentally altered the risk-benefit calculations that had previously made Berserker service attractive to elite warriors, as the potential legal consequences now outweighed the military and social advantages of supernatural combat abilities. The Gulathing law from Western Norway provides detailed evidence of how legal authorities approached the practical problems of regulating Berserker behaviour within Christian legal frameworks. The law code distinguishes between different types of Berserker violence, imposing lighter penalties for actions committed during defensive combat while maintaining severe punishments for unprovoked attacks or violence against non-combatants. These legal distinctions reflect sophisticated understanding of berserker psychology, while establishing clear boundaries for acceptable warrior behaviour within Christianized society. Danish legal developments followed similar patterns but with greater emphasis on royal authority and centralised control over military activities. King Canute the Great, who ruled both Denmark and England during the early 11th century, issued edicts that required all warriors in royal service to swear Christian oaths that explicitly renounced pagan practices, including berserker transformation rituals. Archaeological evidence from military sites associated with Canute's reign reveals the systematic replacement of traditional berserker equipment with standardized Christian military gear, including weapons blessed by church authorities and armor decorated with Christian symbols rather than animal motifs. The transformation of berserker imagery within Christian contexts involved complex processes of reinterpretation and symbolic adaptation that sought to preserve valuable warrior traditions while eliminating their pagan religious associations. Christian chroniclers and hagiographers developed alternative explanations for berserker-like phenomena that attributed supernatural combat abilities to divine favour rather than animal transformation. The Vita of Saint Olaf describes how the saint's warriors displayed extraordinary strength and courage during battles against pagan enemies, but explicitly attributes these abilities to Christian prayer and divine intervention rather than traditional berserker practices. The iconographic transformation of berserker symbols in Christian art and material culture reveals systematic efforts to maintain warrior identity while adapting it to new religious requirements. Archaeological evidence from 11th century church sites reveals carved stone decorations that incorporate bear and wolf imagery but recontextualize these animals as symbols of Christian virtues rather than objects of pagan worship. The Ørnes Stave Church in Norway contains elaborate wood carvings that transform traditional animal interlace patterns into Christian allegories about the triumph of faith over bestial nature. Manuscript illuminations from the 11th and 12th centuries document the gradual transformation of berserker imagery from pagan religious symbols to general representations of warrior prowess within Christian frameworks. The Codex Aureus from Canterbury contains illustrations of Scandinavian warriors that maintain traditional berserker visual elements, including animal-themed armour and weapons, while incorporating Christian symbols and religious imagery that recontextualize these warriors as Christian knights rather than pagan berserkers. This visual transformation reflects broader cultural processes that sought to preserve valuable military traditions while adapting them to new religious and social requirements. The case of Egil Skallagrimsson, documented in both historical sources and saga literature, provides detailed insight into how individual berserkers navigated the transition from pagan to Christian society. Egil's later life, after his conversion to Christianity, involved systematic abandonment of traditional berserker practices while maintaining his reputation as an exceptional warrior and poet. Contemporary sources describe how Egil destroyed his collection of traditional berserker equipment and ritual paraphernalia, while retaining conventional weapons and armour that lacked pagan religious associations. His poetry from this period reveals the psychological difficulties of abandoning practices that had defined his identity and social status for decades. Archaeological evidence from Egil's farm at Borg in Iceland reveals the physical transformation of his household during the conversion period. Excavations have uncovered ritual areas that were deliberately filled and covered during the 11th century, apparently to eliminate spaces associated with traditional berserker practices. The site also contains evidence of a Christian chapel, constructed during Egil's later years, positioned to overlook and symbolically dominate the locations where pagan rituals had previously occurred. Personal artifacts from this period show the gradual replacement of traditional berserker symbols with Christian religious imagery. The fate of Thorda the Berserker, documented in the Landnámabók and various contemporary sources, illustrates the challenges faced by warriors who refused to abandon traditional practices during the Christianization period. Thorda maintained his berserker identity well into the 11th century, continuing to practice transformation rituals and claiming divine inspiration through Odin, despite increasing legal and social pressure to convert. His eventual exile from Iceland around 1030 AD marked one of the last documented cases of traditional berserker practices in the Icelandic settlement, as community pressure and legal restrictions made it impossible for unconverted berserkers to maintain their traditional way of life. The transformation of Thorda's farm after his exile reveals the systematic elimination of berserker material culture from Christianized communities. Archaeological excavations have revealed that his ritual equipment was deliberately destroyed and buried, while his weapons and personal possessions were redistributed among Christian neighbours who removed all pagan religious symbols before reusing the items. The site was subsequently blessed by Christian priests and eventually became the location of a small church that served the local community throughout the medieval period. The documentation of berserker activities in 11th and 12th century sources reveals the gradual marginalization of these warriors as they became increasingly associated with lawlessness and social disruption rather than elite military service. The Saga of Magnus the Good describes several incidents where former berserkers, deprived of their traditional roles within royal military organizations, turned to banditry and mercenary service that brought them into conflict with royal authority. These sources document how berserker combat skills remained formidable even after their social legitimacy had been undermined, creating ongoing security problems for royal governments attempting to establish centralized control over their territories. The career of Bjorn the Berserker, active during the 1040s and 1050s, exemplifies the difficulties faced by traditional warriors attempting to maintain their practices within increasingly Christianized societies. Contemporary sources describe how Bjorn continued practicing berserker transformation rituals while serving as a mercenary for various Scandinavian rulers who valued his combat effectiveness despite his refusal to convert to Christianity. His eventual death during a raid in Ireland around 1055 AD marked one of the last documented instances of traditional berserker activity in major military campaigns. Legal documents from the mid-11th century reveal the systematic prosecution of individuals who continued practicing berserker traditions despite official prohibition. Court records from Norway and Denmark contain multiple cases where former berserkers faced charges related to their traditional practices, including accusations of sorcery, violence against Christians, and violation of royal edicts prohibiting pagan religious activities. These legal proceedings provided detailed evidence of how Christian authorities understood and categorized berserker practices while documenting the persistence of these traditions in remote areas where royal control remained limited. The economic disruption caused by the suppression of berserker traditions affected entire communities that had previously depended on these warriors for protection and military leadership. Archaeological evidence from rural settlements in Norway and Sweden reveals economic decline during the 11th century as traditional warrior farmers abandoned their holdings to avoid religious persecution or legal prosecution. The specialized craftsmen who had produced berserker equipment and ritual paraphernalia faced particular hardship as demand for their services disappeared, forcing many to emigrate or adapt their skills to Christian religious art and conventional weapon production. The international dimension of berserker decline involved the systematic exclusion of these warriors from the military organizations that had traditionally employed their services. The Byzantine Empire, which had recruited Scandinavian warriors for the Varangian Guard throughout the 10th and early 11th centuries, began requiring Christian conversion and oath-taking ceremonies that explicitly renounced pagan practices. Contemporary Byzantine sources describe how berserker applicants who refused these requirements were denied service, effectively ending their access to lucrative mercenary opportunities that had previously sustained many traditional warriors. The transformation of military technology during the 11th and 12th centuries created additional pressures that reduced the battlefield effectiveness of traditional berserker tactics. The increasing use of crossbows, improved armour design, and more sophisticated fortification techniques created combat environments where berserker advantages in individual combat and psychological warfare became less decisive. Military commanders found that disciplined infantry formations and coordinated cavalry charges proved more effective than berserker shock tactics, reducing the demand for these specialised warriors even among leaders who might have been willing to overlook their religious practices. The final documented appearances of traditional berserkers occurred during the Norwegian civil wars of the 12th century, where desperate faction leaders recruited any available warriors regardless of their religious affiliations. The saga of the Sons of Magnus describes several berserkers who fought during these conflicts, but portrays them as anachronistic figures whose traditional practices seemed increasingly out of place in contemporary military contexts. These sources suggest that even sympathetic commanders found berserker warriors difficult to integrate into military organisations that had adapted to new tactical requirements and religious sensibilities. The cultural memory of berserker traditions persisted long after their practical extinction, preserved in modified forms through saga literature, folk tales, and artistic representations that stripped away their pagan religious associations, while maintaining their appeal as symbols of warrior prowess and supernatural ability. This cultural transformation allowed Scandinavian societies to maintain connections to their martial heritage while adapting to new religious and social frameworks that emphasize Christian virtue and royal authority over individual supernatural enhancement. The gradual transformation of berserker terminology during the 12th and 13th centuries marked a fundamental shift in how Scandinavian societies understood and categorized violent behavior. Legal documents from this period reveal that the term berserkir increasingly appeared in context divorced from its original religious and military associations, becoming instead a general designation for criminals who employed excessive violence or claimed supernatural justification for their actions. The earliest examples of this semantic evolution appear in Norwegian court records from the 1140s, where individuals described as berserkers faced prosecution for assault, theft, and extortion rather than violations of religious law or military misconduct. The Gragas, the comprehensive legal code that governed medieval Iceland from approximately 1117 to 1262, contains the most detailed surviving regulations addressing berserker-type behaviour within a Christian legal framework. Section 155 of the Gragas specifically addresses berserksganga as a criminal offence punishable by full outlawry, the most severe penalty available under Icelandic law. The legal text describes berserkergang not as a religious practice or military tactic, but as a form of violent madness that threatened public order and individual safety. The law requires witnesses to testify about specific behavioural indicators, including uncontrolled trembling, facial swelling, and inhuman vocalizations that preceded violent episodes. The legal definition provided in the Gragas reveals sophisticated understanding of the psychological and physical manifestations associated with berserker transformation, while completely rejecting any supernatural or divine explanations for these phenomena. The code treats berserkergang as a medical condition that could affect any individual regardless of their religious beliefs or military training, requiring legal intervention to protect society from dangerous individuals who could not control their violent impulses. This medicalization of berserker behavior reflected broader medieval trends toward rational explanation of psychological disorders while maintaining the practical need to regulate violent crime. Contemporary court records from the Althing, Iceland's National Assembly, document numerous cases where the berserker gang provisions of the Gragas were applied to prosecute violent criminals. The case of Thorstein Egilsson in 1156 provides detailed evidence of how legal authorities investigated and prosecuted alleged berserker behaviour. Witnesses testified that Thorstein had displayed the characteristic physical signs of berserker gang before attacking several neighbours during a property dispute, causing serious injuries while claiming that spirits had possessed him. The court rejected his supernatural defence, ruling that his behaviour constituted criminal assault regardless of any claimed spiritual influences. The legal proceedings against Thorstein reveal the evidentiary standards that medieval courts applied when evaluating berserker-related crimes. Prosecutors were required to demonstrate that the defendant had exhibited specific physical and behavioural symptoms before committing violent acts, including testimony from multiple witnesses about trembling, facial changes, and altered speech patterns. The court also required evidence that the defendant had claimed supernatural justification for their actions, distinguishing between ordinary criminal violence and behaviour that specifically invoked berserker traditions. These evidentiary requirements reflect sophisticated legal thinking about the relationship between mental state and criminal responsibility. Norwegian legal developments during the reign of King Magnus VI established similar frameworks for prosecuting berserker-type violence, while adapting Icelandic precedents to Norwegian political and social conditions. The Landslov of 1274 contains provisions that specifically address individuals who claimed divine inspiration or animal transformation as justification for violent behaviour. The Norwegian approach differed from Icelandic law by treating such claims as blasphemy against Christian doctrine rather than simply criminal assault, reflecting the stronger royal authority and more centralised religious control that characterised 13th century Norway. Danish legal codes from the same period demonstrate yet another approach to regulating berserker-type behaviour, emphasising the threat that such individuals pose to royal authority and public order. The Jutlandic law, codified around 1241, contains provisions that treat berserker violence as a form of treason when committed by individuals who had previously served in royal military forces. This legal framework reflected Danish concerns about former military personnel who might use their combat training and claims of supernatural ability to challenge royal authority or terrorise local populations. The transformation of berserkers from honoured warriors to legal outcasts involved complex social processes that extended beyond simple religious conversion or legal prohibition. Archaeological evidence from 12th and 13th century settlement sites reveals the gradual exclusion of individuals associated with berserker traditions from normal community activities. Excavations at farmsteads in western Iceland show the systematic destruction of buildings and artefacts associated with families that had maintained berserker traditions, suggesting that social pressure complemented legal sanctions in eliminating these practices from medieval Scandinavian society. The case of the Svinafell berserkers, documented in multiple 13th century sources, illustrates how entire family groups could become marginalised when they refused to abandon traditional practices. The Svinafell family had maintained berserker traditions for several generations, with family members serving as mercenaries and bodyguards for various Icelandic chieftains. During the 1220s, as Christian influence strengthened and legal restrictions tightened, the family found themselves increasingly isolated from their neighbours and unable to find legitimate employment. Archaeological evidence from their farmstead reveals gradual abandonment during this period, with valuable possessions buried or hidden rather than sold, suggesting that the family expected eventual return that never materialised. Legal documents from the bishopric of Skalholt provide additional evidence of systematic persecution directed against individuals who maintained berserker traditions or claimed supernatural combat abilities. Bishop Thorlekur Thorholson, who served from 1178 to 1193, issued numerous edicts that specifically targeted berserker practices as incompatible with Christian faith and social order. Church records document the excommunication of several individuals who refused to renounce their berserker identities, effectively excluding them from Christian society and making normal social interaction impossible. The economic dimensions of Berserker persecution involved systematic exclusion from trade networks, marriage alliances, and property transactions that formed the foundation of medieval Scandinavian society. Legal documents from Bergen and other Norwegian trading centres contain numerous examples of commercial agreements that specifically excluded individuals known to have Berserker associations. These economic sanctions proved particularly effective in forcing conformity, as even individuals who maintained private adherence to Berserker traditions found it necessary to publicly renounce these practices to maintain their livelihoods. Court records from the 1180s document the prosecution of Erikar the Berserker, whose case demonstrates how legal authorities dealt with individuals who attempted to maintain traditional practices while adapting to Christian social requirements. Erikar had served as a mercenary for various Norwegian jarls before settling in Iceland around 1175. He initially attempted to integrate into Icelandic society by marrying a local woman and establishing a farm, but neighbours complained about his continued practice of Berserker transformation rituals. When local authorities investigated these complaints, they discovered that Erikar maintained a hidden shrine where he performed animal transformation ceremonies and claimed communication with Odin. The legal proceedings against Erikar reveal the sophisticated investigative techniques that medieval courts employed when prosecuting Berserker-related crimes. Authorities conducted detailed searches of his property, discovering ritual equipment including bear pelts, carved wooden masks, and weapons decorated with runic inscriptions invoking Odin's protection. Witnesses testified about strange sounds and lights emanating from Erikar's property during certain nights, while others described his unusual behaviour during community gatherings. The court ultimately convicted Erikar of practising pagan sorcery and sentenced him to full outlawry, confiscating his property and banishing him from Iceland. The documentation of Berserker persecution extends beyond individual cases to include systematic campaigns directed against entire communities suspected of maintaining traditional practices. The saga of Bishop Thorlakur describes coordinated efforts by church and secular authorities to eliminate Berserker traditions from remote areas of Iceland where royal and episcopal control remained limited. These campaigns involved armed expeditions that searched for hidden ritual sites, confiscated traditional weapons and ceremonial equipment, and arrested individuals suspected of practicing Berserker transformation. Archaeological evidence from sites in the Westfjords region of Iceland reveals the physical destruction associated with these anti-Berserker campaigns. Excavations at Rikalar have uncovered the remains of a ritual complex that was systematically destroyed during the late 12th century, with stone circles dismantled, wooden structures burned, and ritual artefacts deliberately broken and scattered. The site subsequently remained uninhabited for several decades, suggesting that local communities avoided areas associated with suppressed Berserker activities. The legal treatment of Berserker-related violence evolved throughout the 13th century as courts gained experience with these cases and developed more sophisticated approaches to prosecution and punishment. Early cases often resulted in execution or permanent exile, reflecting uncertainty about how to handle individuals whose behaviour seemed to transcend normal categories of criminal activity. Later legal developments emphasised rehabilitation and social reintegration, particularly for younger individuals who could demonstrate genuine renunciation of Berserker practices. The case of Gudmundur Thorsson, prosecuted in 1198, demonstrates this evolution in legal thinking. Gudmundur, the son of a known Berserker, had displayed violent tendencies from childhood and claimed ability to communicate with animal spirits. When he reached adulthood and committed several assaults during alleged Berserker episodes, local authorities faced the question of whether his behaviour resulted from inherited supernatural abilities or learned criminal behaviour. The court ultimately ruled that Gudmundur could avoid outlawry by undergoing Christian religious instruction and publicly renouncing any claims to supernatural ability. The rehabilitation process developed for former berserkers involved extensive religious education, public confession of past practices, and ongoing supervision by church authorities. Legal documents describe specific procedures that required former berserkers to destroy their traditional equipment, renounce their animal spirit connections, and demonstrate Christian behavior through regular church attendance and charitable activities. These rehabilitation programs reflected medieval understanding of berserker behavior as learned rather than inherited, suggesting that appropriate intervention could successfully reintegrate dangerous individuals into Christian society. Contemporary medical texts from the 13th century provide additional insight into how educated medieval observers understood berserker behaviour and the legal problems it created. The writings of Olafur Vitaskald, an Icelandic scholar who studied at the University of Paris, describe berserker gang as a form of melancholia caused by excessive consumption of certain foods and exposure to supernatural influences. His medical theories influenced legal thinking about criminal responsibility and appropriate punishment for individuals whose violent behaviour might result from medical conditions rather than criminal intent. The international dimension of berserker persecution involved coordination between different legal systems as these warriors moved between kingdoms seeking refuge from prosecution. Norwegian and Danish authorities developed extradition agreements that prevented berserkers from escaping justice by crossing political boundaries. Legal documents from the 1190s describe negotiations between King Sverre of Norway and various Icelandic chieftains regarding the return of fugitive berserkers who had fled Norwegian justice by settling in Iceland. The final phase of berserker persecution during the early 13th century involved systematic efforts to eliminate not only active practitioners, but also the cultural memory and material artifacts associated with these traditions. Legal authorities ordered the destruction of traditional weapons, ritual equipment, and even oral traditions that preserved knowledge of berserker practices. Church authorities required the burning of manuscripts and carved objects that contained berserker imagery or runic inscriptions invoking animal spirits. The effectiveness of these suppression efforts varied significantly across different regions and social contexts. Urban areas with strong royal and episcopal control achieved relatively complete elimination of berserker traditions by 1200, while remote rural areas maintained modified practices well into the 13th century. Archaeological evidence suggests that some individuals continued practicing berserker transformation in secret, adapting their rituals to avoid detection while maintaining core elements of their traditional beliefs. The legal documentation of berserker persecution provides crucial evidence for understanding both the practical implementation of Christian conversion and the resistance that traditional practices encountered during this transition period. Court records reveal that many individuals prosecuted for berserker-related crimes genuinely believed in the supernatural nature of their abilities while struggling to understand why practices that had previously brought honour and social status had become criminal offences. This cultural confusion contributed to the violence and social disruption that characterised the final phase of berserker history in medieval Scandinavia. The transformation of berserker traditions from living warrior practices to historical memory began immediately following their legal suppression in the 13th century, creating complex processes of cultural transmission that would influence military traditions, artistic expression, and national identity formation across Northern Europe for centuries to come. The systematic documentation of berserker practices in Icelandic sagas and legal codes preserved detailed knowledge of their equipment, training methods, and social organisation that later military theorists would study and adapt for contemporary purposes. Medieval chroniclers and military writers drew upon berserker examples when developing tactical manuals for professional armies, particularly regarding the psychological aspects of combat motivation and the management of elite warrior units within larger military organizations. The influence of berserker tactical concepts appeared prominently in the military reforms undertaken by Gustav II Adolf of Sweden during the early 17th century. Swedish military archives contain detailed studies of medieval Scandinavian warfare that specifically analyse berserker shock tactics and their psychological effects on enemy formations. Gustav Adolf's military innovations included the systematic use of elite assault troops trained to break enemy lines through coordinated attacks that combined firepower with aggressive, close-quarters combat. These stormtroops received specialised training that emphasised psychological preparation, unit cohesion, and the cultivation of aggressive mindset that military theorists explicitly connected to historical berserker traditions. The organisational structure of Gustav Adolf's elite units reflected careful study of berserker brotherhood systems documented in medieval sources. Military regulations from this period describe selection criteria that emphasise not only physical prowess and combat skills, but also psychological characteristics including aggression, loyalty to unit members, and ability to maintain effectiveness under extreme stress. Training regimens incorporated elements derived from berserker practices including isolation exercises, stress conditioning, and group bonding activities designed to create the intense unit loyalty that had characterised medieval warrior brotherhoods. Danish military developments during the same period demonstrated similar interest in adapting berserker traditions to contemporary warfare. The military reforms of Christian IV included establishment of specialised assault companies that drew explicitly upon historical berserker models while adapting them to gunpowder warfare requirements. Danish military manuals from the 1620s described training procedures that combined traditional berserker psychological conditioning with modern weapons training, creating hybrid warrior units that maintained the aggressive mindset of their medieval predecessors while employing contemporary military technology. The influence of berserker traditions extended beyond Scandinavian military organisations to affect broader European military culture during the early modern period. Military theorists across Europe studied medieval Scandinavian warfare as part of broader investigations into the psychological dimensions of combat effectiveness. French military academies incorporated berserker case studies into their curricula on military psychology, while Prussian staff officers analysed berserker tactical deployment when developing doctrine for elite military units. These studies contributed to the development of modern military psychology and the systematic understanding of combat stress, unit cohesion, and leadership under extreme conditions. Archaeological discoveries during the 19th and 20th centuries provided unprecedented insight into the material culture and social organisation of historical berserker warriors, fundamentally transforming scholarly understanding of these traditions, while generating new interpretations that often reflected contemporary political and cultural concerns. The excavation of major Viking Age sites, including Birka, Hedeby, and Trelleborg, revealed extensive evidence of specialised warrior equipment, training facilities, and burial practices that confirmed many details preserved in saga literature, while contradicting romantic interpretations that had dominated earlier scholarship. The discovery of the Mammen burial in 1868 provided the first definitive archaeological evidence of high-status berserker equipment, revealing the sophisticated craftsmanship and expensive materials associated with elite warrior gear. The burial contained a magnificent battle axe with silver inlay depicting complex animal interlace patterns, along with textile fragments that preserved evidence of bear fur clothing and leather equipment decorated with metal fittings shaped like animal claws. Chemical analysis of the axe blade revealed advanced metallurgical techniques that produced superior cutting performance, while microscopic examination of the textile remains confirmed the use of specially prepared bear pelts that retained their spiritual significance through careful preservation methods. Subsequent discoveries at sites like Repton, Kilmainham, and Island Bridge reveal the international scope of berserker activities during the Viking Age, while documenting regional variations in equipment and burial practices. The Repton burial ground, associated with the Great Heathen Army's winter quarters in 874 AD, contained numerous warrior graves with distinctive weapon assemblages that included oversized axes, specialized spears, and animal-themed personal ornaments. Isotopic analysis of skeletal remains from these burials revealed that many of the warriors had originated in different regions of Scandinavia, suggesting that berserker units recruited members from across the Norse world, rather than relying solely on local warrior traditions. The application of modern scientific techniques to berserker archaeological materials has provided crucial insights into the practical aspects of their transformation practices and combat effectiveness. Microscopic analysis of weapon edges from berserker graves reveals distinctive wear patterns that confirm the use of specific combat techniques described in saga literature, while chemical analysis of residues from drinking vessels has identified plant compounds that may have been used to enhance psychological preparation for battle. Skeletal analysis reveals evidence of intensive physical training that produced distinctive bone modifications, while dental analysis indicates dietary practices that align with fasting regimen as described in historical sources. Contemporary popular culture representations of berserkers demonstrate both the enduring fascination with these warrior traditions and the systematic distortion of historical reality that occurs when ancient practices are adapted for modern entertainment purposes. Hollywood films, television series, and video games typically portray berserkers as primitive savages who fought naked while under the influence of hallucinogenic drugs, creating dramatic visual spectacles that bear little resemblance to the sophisticated warrior culture documented in historical and archaeological sources. These popular representations emphasize sensational elements including extreme violence, supernatural transformation, and primitive behavior while ignoring the complex religious, social, and military frameworks that actually governed berserker practices. The television series Vikings exemplifies both the potential and limitations of popular media attempts to portray berserker traditions. The series incorporates some historically accurate elements, including the use of specialized weapons, animal symbolism, and pre-battle rituals, while simultaneously perpetuating misconceptions about berserker behavior and social organization. The show's portrayal of berserkers as unpredictable individuals who could transform spontaneously during combat reflects modern psychological interpretations rather than historical evidence, which indicates that berserker transformation required extensive preparation and occurred within controlled ritual frameworks. Video game representations of berserkers typically emphasize their combat effectiveness while completely divorcing them from their historical, religious, and social contexts. Games like Assassin's Creed Valhalla and God of War present berserkers as boss enemies or playable character types, defined primarily by their enhanced combat abilities and distinctive visual appearance. These representations focus on gameplay mechanics that allow players to experience enhanced strength and reduced damage while ignoring the complex spiritual preparation, social obligations, and cultural significance that defined historical berserker traditions. The contrast between popular culture representations and historical reality reveals the ongoing influence of 19th century Romantic nationalism on contemporary understanding of berserker traditions. Romantic scholars and artists created idealized images of berserkers as symbols of primitive Germanic virtue and natural warrior spirit that continue to influence modern interpretations despite contradicting archaeological and textual evidence. These Romantic interpretations emphasized the supposed connection between berserkers and untamed nature, while ignoring their sophisticated military organization and integration into complex political structures. Modern archaeological research has systematically challenged Romantic interpretations of berserker culture, while revealing the sophisticated nature of their military organisation and social integration. Excavations at training sites like Trelleborg and Fierkat have revealed complex facilities designed for coordinated military exercises rather than individual warrior development, indicating that berserkers operated within disciplined military frameworks rather than as independent savage fighters. Analysis of berserker equipment reveals standardized production methods and quality control that required extensive craft specialization and economic organization, contradicting images of primitive warriors using crude weapons and improvised gear. The influence of berserker imagery on Scandinavian cultural identity and military heritage has evolved significantly since the medieval period, reflecting changing political circumstances and cultural values while maintaining connections to ancient warrior traditions. During the 19th century, berserker symbolism became associated with emerging nationalist movements that sought to establish distinctive Scandinavian cultural identities separate from broader European influences. Norwegian, Danish, and Swedish intellectuals drew upon berserker traditions as evidence of their ancestors' martial prowess and cultural sophistication, creating national narratives that emphasized the unique character of Scandinavian civilization. The incorporation of berserker symbolism into modern Scandinavian military traditions demonstrates the continuing relevance of these ancient warrior practices for contemporary military culture. The Norwegian Army's Telemark Battalion, which specializes in Arctic warfare and special operations, incorporates bear symbolism derived from berserker traditions into its unit insignia and ceremonial practices. Training exercises emphasize the psychological conditioning and unit cohesion that characterized historical berserker brotherhoods, while maintaining modern professional military standards and ethical frameworks. Danish military traditions similarly incorporate berserker heritage through ceremonial practices and unit designations that honor historical warrior culture while adapting it to contemporary military requirements. The Danish Royal Guard maintains ceremonial weapons and equipment that reference medieval berserker traditions, while Special Forces units employ training methods that draw upon historical knowledge of berserker psychological preparation and combat effectiveness. These modern adaptations demonstrate the continuing relevance of berserker tactical concepts while maintaining clear distinctions between historical practices and contemporary military professionalism. Swedish military heritage preservation includes extensive documentation and display of berserker archaeological materials in military museums that educate contemporary soldiers about their historical predecessors while promoting understanding of Swedish military traditions. The Army Museum in Stockholm contains comprehensive exhibitions that present berserker culture within its proper historical context, emphasizing their role as elite professional warriors rather than primitive savages. These educational programs help contemporary military personnel understand the evolution of Swedish military culture while fostering pride in their historical heritage. The academic study of berserker traditions has evolved dramatically since the early 20th century, as scholars have gained access to new archaeological evidence and developed more sophisticated analytical methods for interpreting historical sources. Early academic work was heavily influenced by romantic nationalism and primitive psychology theories that portrayed berserkers as examples of evolutionary throwbacks or psychological aberrations. Contemporary scholarship emphasizes the sophisticated nature of berserker culture and their integration into complex political and military systems, while acknowledging the genuine psychological and physiological aspects of their transformation practices. Modern interdisciplinary research combines archaeological evidence with insights from psychology, neuroscience, and military studies to develop comprehensive understanding of berserker practices and their historical significance. Neurological research has identified plausible mechanisms for the altered states of consciousness described in historical sources, while psychological studies of modern military personnel provide insights into the group dynamics and stress responses that characterized berserker units. These scientific approaches have validated many aspects of Berserker practices while eliminating supernatural explanations that dominated earlier interpretations. The international scholarly community has developed sophisticated methodologies for analysing Berserker traditions that avoid both romantic idealization and dismissive skepticism. Comparative studies examine Berserker practices alongside similar warrior traditions from other cultures, revealing common patterns in elite military organisation and psychological conditioning that transcend specific cultural contexts. These comparative approaches have demonstrated that Berserker traditions represent sophisticated adaptations to specific military and social requirements, rather than unique expressions of Scandinavian cultural characteristics. The preservation of Berserker archaeological materials and historical sites has become a priority for Scandinavian cultural heritage organisations that recognise their importance for understanding medieval military culture and social organisation. Major archaeological sites including Birka, Trelleborg and Gamla Uppsala receive extensive conservation funding and public interpretation programs that present Berserker culture within its proper historical context. These preservation efforts ensure that future generations will have access to authentic archaeological evidence rather than relying solely on popular culture representations or romantic interpretations. Educational programs in Scandinavian schools increasingly incorporate accurate information about Berserker traditions as part of broader curricula on medieval history and cultural heritage. These programs emphasize critical analysis of historical sources and archaeological evidence, while encouraging students to distinguish between historical reality and popular culture representations. Educational materials present Berserker culture as one aspect of complex medieval societies rather than as isolated examples of primitive warrior behaviour. The lasting impact of Berserker traditions on European military culture extends far beyond their historical period of activity, influencing concepts of elite military service, unit cohesion, and combat psychology that remain relevant for contemporary military organisations. Modern special forces training incorporates psychological conditioning techniques that parallel Berserker practices, while military leadership development programs study Berserker brotherhood organisation as examples of effective small unit leadership and team building. These contemporary applications demonstrate the enduring relevance of Berserker innovations in military organisation and combat effectiveness. The Berserker phenomenon represents one of the most sophisticated examples of pre-modern military psychology and elite warrior organisation, combining religious belief, physical conditioning, and tactical innovation in ways that maximize combat effectiveness while maintaining social integration. Their transformation from honoured elite warriors to persecuted outcasts reflects broader changes in European society as centralised monarchies and Christian institutions replace decentralised warrior cultures with more regulated military organisations. The careful documentation of their practices in saga literature and legal codes, combined with extensive archaeological evidence, provides unprecedented insight into the complex relationships between religion, warfare, and social organisation in medieval Scandinavia. Modern understanding of Berserker traditions continues to evolve as new archaeological discoveries and analytical techniques reveal additional aspects of their culture and historical significance. The systematic study of these warrior traditions contributes not only to knowledge of medieval Scandinavian history, but also to broader understanding of military psychology, religious practice, and social change in pre-modern European societies. The Berserkers remain compelling figures not because of romantic fantasies about primitive warriors, but because their sophisticated adaptation of psychological, spiritual, and tactical innovations created military effectiveness that influenced European warfare for centuries after their disappearance from the historical record.